Today's episode of the Gone Fission Nuclear Report is brought to you by Fluor. We're building a better world. Welcome to the Gone Fission Nuclear Report, your one-stop source for all the latest news from the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Program. Now, here's your host, Michael Butler.
Hello and welcome to the Gone Fission Nuclear Report. Today is Monday, November 28th, 2022. We're covering all the news from the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Program across the country. We thank our friends at Fluor for being presenting sponsor for today's episode. There are many stakeholders who have an interest in the success of the Department of Energy's environmental cleanup program. But perhaps there are none more important than the communities where these sites are located. For the most part, these communities have lived with the risk posed by these sites for decades. They also have benefited from the thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in buying power that the sites represent. Today, the Department of Energy values community input and welcomes these communities to take a seat at the table. Much of their success in obtaining access has been thanks to the Energy Communities Alliance, or ECA. This DC-based group advocates for communities all across the country with the Department of Energy and Congress. To promote the community's interests, ECA recently published a guide to successful environmental cleanup.
We created the guide because we get questions all the time on the cleanup program, and some of them are basic, like, what does this acronym actually mean? How do the laws work? Why is the department acting a certain way? How do I understand what the budget is at my site? So we tried to put together a guide that was interactive, that included videos, that included infographics, that included questions and answers to answer all the questions that we were getting on a regular basis. And so we tried to put it online also. It was kind of a follow-up from our Politics of Cleanup, which was a published guide from about 10 years ago that identified how the cleanup program actually worked, how it evolved. And now this guide is really something that we're hoping is going to be interactive. So if people have questions, they'll reach out to us with a question and we'll actually post it on the guide. So we'll always be updated and we'll try and continually identify what's going on at the individual sites, how laws change, how policies, the budget, etc. So communities always have one place to go to hopefully find the answers to their questions related to the environmental cleanup program.
We'll learn more about the new ECA Community Guide later in the podcast. And we'll be back with today's headlines right after this from Fluor. Workers at the nation's only underground nuclear waste repository have started using a newly mined disposal area at the underground facility in southern New Mexico. Officials at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant made the announcement last week, saying the first containers of waste to be entombed in the new area came from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. ORNL is one of the many labs and government sites across the country that package waste and ship it to WIPP. Known as Panel 8, the new area consists of 7 separate rooms for placing special boxes and barrels packed with lab coats, rubber gloves, tools, and debris contaminated with plutonium and other radioactive elements. Each room measures 33 feet wide, 16 feet high, and runs the length of a football field. Carved out of an ancient salt formation about half a mile deep, the subterranean landfill located outside of Carlsbad received its first shipment in 1999. The idea is that the shifting salt will eventually entomb the radioactive waste left from decades of bomb making and nuclear weapons research. In 2014, a fire and separate radiation release forced a nearly 3-year closure of the repository and a costly overhaul of the policies and procedures that govern WIP and the nation's multi-billion-dollar cleanup program for Cold War-era waste. Operations had to be reduced after the repository reopened because areas of the facility were contaminated and airflow needed for mining and disposal operations was limited. Now a multi-million-dollar project is underway to install a new ventilation system. 2 top EM officials have been honored by the White House with 2022 Presidential Rank Awards. EM Senior Advisor Ike White received the 2022 Presidential Rank Award for Distinguished Executives. He joins a select cadre of senior executives recognized for sustained superior leadership performance. And Jay Mullis, EM's Acting Associate Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regulatory and Policy Affairs, received the Meritorious Executive Award as part of the 2022 Presidential Rank Awards. Mullis is a former manager of DOE's Oak Ridge Office of Environmental Management. Congratulations to these 2 men for these prestigious awards. And finally, how was your Thanksgiving? Were you able to find the deals you wanted on Black Friday? It's a great day to get a bargain on a gift for that special someone, but you may have missed the biggest bargain of all. Shoppers had a one-day opportunity to save $1 million on the purchase of a piece of nuclear history. The Mini Museum offered a shield window from Hanford's historic tea plant at a $1 million discount off its usual asking price of $3.4 million. According to the museum's website, through this crystal clear window, Hanford scientists produced the plutonium that would eventually be used in the world's first atomic bomb explosion, the Trinity nuclear test. Hanford's tea plant was the world's first large-scale plutonium separation facility. The 1,700-pound, 54-inch long window was sold at a government auction in the late 1980s. It is the largest known complete window from the plant in private hands. We'll be back with today's Spotlight interview right after this from Fluor. We're talking with Seth Kirshenberg today. Seth is Executive Director of the Energy Communities Alliance in Washington, D.C. ECA plays a very important role in maintaining communications and facilitating solutions between DOE communities and the Department of Energy in Washington. They also work very closely with members of Congress on the Hill on funding and other issues. Seth, welcome to the podcast.
Mike, how are you doing today?
Well, you've been a guest on the podcast before. As a matter of fact, your earlier appearance was one of the most popular episodes we had in our audio podcast series before we began the video podcasts, and we're very glad to have you back here today. Let's start with giving our listeners and viewers just a reminder about what ECA is and the role that it plays with the DOE communities.
And so ECA was started 30 years ago by a couple of different local communities at a meeting where they got together. And, don't forget, at the time, the Cold War was really just wrapping up. EM was being created, and the communities around Hanford and Idaho Falls and at Ineal, at Savannah River, Rocky Flats, and a couple of other sites, Mound, they got together at a National League of Cities meeting and realized that the communications and the issues that they were being approached on by the Department of Energy were all very different. Thousands of people were being laid off. from the weapons program at the time. And so ECA was a way to bring those together. We evolved over those 30 years into an organization that initially only focused on trying to figure out how to communicate with the Department of Energy, to one that now works very closely with the Department of Energy on a lot of different issues. And our goal is to really make sure that the department includes local governments and local communities in its decision making.
Well, today we're here to talk about the community cleanup guide that ECA has prepared for the communities and for others who have an interest in the environmental cleanup program. Can you tell us why there was a need for a guide like this? Why was it important to have this kind of an interactive document?
We created the guide because we get questions all the time on the cleanup program, and some of them are basic, like, what does this acronym actually mean? How do the laws work? Why is the department acting a certain way? How do I understand what the budget is at my site? So we tried to put together a guide that was interactive, that included videos, that included infographics, that included questions and answers to answer all the questions that we were getting on a regular basis. And so we tried to put it online also. It was kind of a follow-up from our Politics of Cleanup, which was a published guide from about 10 years ago that identified how the cleanup program actually worked, how it evolved. And now this guide is really something that we're hoping is going to be interactive. So if people have questions, they'll reach out to us with a question and we'll actually post it on the guide. So we'll always be updated, and we'll try and continually identify what's going on at the individual sites, how laws change, how policies, the budget, etc. So communities always have one place to go to hopefully find the answers to their questions related to the environmental cleanup program.
The environmental cleanup program is over 30 years old now, and DOE communities have been involved with the program from the start. That participation and involvement has changed and evolved over time. How does it stand today? Can you give us can you kind of characterize what the level of engagement is? And are we at a point where community involvement is more important and maybe more urgent than ever before?
Yeah, it's interesting. As this evolved, it started off with, if we remember the beginning of the program, it was all about the Department of Energy being sued. Remember, there was the FBI raid at Rocky Flats. The states had a very litigious relationships with the Department of Energy, and the Department of Energy fought them and fought everybody on everything. In the beginning, the communities were told, you're not important, we don't have to pay attention to you. But I think as we evolved over those 30 years, all of a sudden the relationship became important. The department started to understand that with cleanup issues, you have to have land use and you have to have understanding of what's the future use of the site. And places like Rocky Flats, Mound, and Fernald, it was all about the community selecting the future use of those particular sites and the cleanup occurring and being focused on those. And I think that we've seen that evolution at these different sites as we've kind of moved forward. And what we've seen is successes over time, not just in the cleanup program, but in opportunities for the communities as well. When I look at Oak Ridge and I look at the former K-25 facility, I see opportunity for new nuclear development at that site where it was once really just thought of as a major cleanup liability site. I see that throughout the country. We see what the Port of Benton has done with a lot of former DOE land at the Hanford site. And it really is unbelievable to see that, our communities are going from just cleanup sites to now being at the cutting edge of a lot of energy development.
In general, how would you rate the level of community engagement and community leadership at the DOE communities? Is it significant? Is it making a difference? Can you give an example of how community involvement is impacting DOE decision making in the cleanup program?
Sure. In my mind, the local engagement has grown because both the local community and the department have seen the value in it. Setting priorities for cleanup is obviously a critical issue. And you know what we just held a meeting in August on new nuclear development at a lot of Department of Energy facilities. And what we're seeing is the engagement and the idea that we can clean up a particular site, we can reuse it, and we can create something new. Assist the cleanup program because they know what they need to clean up the particular area to. And we can integrate cleanup and new energy programs with the leadership of the community. They're the ones who set these priorities. And in every single one of these communities, you see the mayors, the council members, the county commissioners, and all the elected officials coming together around these particular issues and really focus on them. Once again, I would talk about Oak Ridge, and it's amazing to see the manufacturing facilities that are going in at those particular sites. It's great to see that after all this time when it was focused just on cleanup, that we're seeing that. And that's because you see the investment in infrastructure by the communities and the Department of Energy working together to try and make these projects successful.
Many community leaders are elected officials, and this would indicate perhaps that there's a lot of turnover in the audience that you deal with at the local level. Do you find that there is a lot of turnover? Or are you constantly in an education mode in terms of keeping local community leaders involved and informed about what's going on in the environmental cleanup program?
We every 2 years we have a couple of council members and community leaders change over. And what's great about ECA, the original founders of the organization, they tried to ensure that you had an elected official and an appointed official at each of the sites because they recognize that you're going to have changes in elections over time. And so we keep having new people with new ideas, which is great. And one of the reasons why we created the guide is one of the mayors, who's now a long-serving mayor, said to us when she first started to say, "What are we talking about here? What's this language that you all use? What are these acronyms?" And so, we tried to come up with, we called it the cheat sheet of acronyms, but we tried to put together that information so it would be easier. And as issues come up, throughout the year, you have budget issues, you have actual cleanup issues, you have emergencies sometimes at the individual sites. And we need to make sure that the elected officials know, what the issues are and what's going on. And we're also lucky because a lot of the elected officials actually have worked at the site in the past or currently work at the site at some of these larger sites, and they really add a lot. We had a former mayor, Steve Young, from Kennewick, and if he didn't explain how contracting worked to all of our communities, I don't think we would have ever picked it up. And it's those types of things that really are great and helpful for our communities and for the department.
Some sites have more troubling, more complex, longer term environmental cleanup issues than others. That could maybe lend itself to a situation where the squeaky wheel gets the grease and you have to pay more attention to one site than another. Do you find that that's the case, or do you try to be pretty even-handed across the board?
We obviously try to maintain that, but what we find is that the communities that engage with us the most are the ones who are probably benefiting the most from the relationships with the Department of Energy and or are trying to create that relationship with the Department of Energy. So when we talk across all the sites, it's very, very different. At some sites, that relationship is strained with EM, and at other sites, it's the strongest relationship that you can imagine. And so we're trying to make sure that headquarters at the local site level, they understand what the issues are, and that the community understands the issues that the Department of Energy is also facing. Because it's easy to say, well, all the money's going to one side or another, when the reality is it's not necessarily the department's decision on how that happens. That's a congressional decision on how that happens. But decisions locally can make a big difference. And so we're always trying to bridge that, and we do spend a lot of time on those types of things. But the ECA and the staff, we love it. That's half the fun is working with the communities to try and help them come up with a solution to some very, very difficult issues.
Are there problems or challenges that are common to all DOE sites? I think about something like payment in lieu of taxes. I know that doesn't affect everybody, but it does affect some sites. Are there other problems that are common problems that you have to deal with across the board?
Workforce is probably the most common issue that affects every site, and the rules that are utilized. And it's really interesting because EM, Office of Science, NE, NNSA, they all have a little bit different rules on how that works. The interaction and dealing with community investment by the contractors that operate at the site. Once again, all the offices have a little bit different rules or interpretation of the rules on how those particular things occur. Budget is always a big issue at all the different sites, and we try and make sure that everybody understands how the budget's developed, when they can provide input, what the issues are at the appropriations level in Congress, what OMB and how they play into it, and then how the Department of Energy and its requests evolves over time. So we're always working on that. And then lastly, there's a regulatory piece that impacts all these different sites if we're talking about cleanup. And trying to deal with all of those, even though it may be different because of the different states, there's also a commonality. So one of the things that ECA tries to do is we work very closely with organizations like ECOS and the other intergovernmental organizations, and we actually have an intergovernmental meeting every year where we try and resolve these issues. So it's National Governors Association, it's State and Tribal Working Government, it's National Conference of State Legislatures, National Association of Attorney Generals, Environmental Council of States, and ECA, where we try and resolve and deal with a lot of these different cleanup issues.
One of the points you make in the community guide is the importance of trust in the community engagement activity. How would you characterize the level of trust that exists between DOE and its communities today? Has that changed over time? And importantly, what is the key to trust in this kind of a situation?
Yeah, the good news is environmental management is a very bipartisan issue. And we had Congressman Lee and Congressman Fleischman speak at our last cleanup workshop meeting in September. And they spoke back to back, Democrat and Republican. They're both heads of the cleanup caucus. And both of them talked about the importance of the cleanup program. So that's first, and that's really critical. It looks like in the House, we're going to see the Republicans take over leadership. In that case, Congressman Simpson or Congressman Fleischman are likely to be the head of the Appropriations Committee. So we'll have somebody from one of our sites, from the Energy and Water Appropriations, excuse me. So it looks like we may have somebody from one of our sites being the head of that office, which is really critical. In the Senate, we've got strong relationships with the leadership on that side as well. We don't know if it's going to change or not, but that's something we're watching. And in the Armed Services Committees, it looks like we may have some changes for the subcommittees that oversee us. But once again, the issues related to EM are bipartisan, which is great. And what we've seen is, we've seen increases almost every year. I'm not sure we're going to see that next year, especially with a split Congress. And so there's going to have to be a real focus on budget issues kind of coming out. And we've already seen the communities around Hanford Site and Washington have already talked about let's all work together to look at increasing the EM budget. And that's something that within all of our communities that we've started to talk about. And I know we're going to be talking about that as it goes into the president's request, which is going to come out in the end of January, early February.
And what advice do you give to community leaders in dealing with DOE on cleanup issues?
I'm going to start with the last part of that question. The key to trust is really the communication and making sure that you're sharing information, that you're being truthful on all sides. And usually the local community is dealing with the site manager the most, but they also deal with a lot of headquarters folks. I'm focused now on EM more than I'm focused on other parts of the department. And at most of the sites, that's a strong relationship. But you have issues at every site. So there's some sites where the trust level is low, and you have some sites where the trust level is high. I always like to say Mayor Gary, who's the chair of Energy Communities Alliance, he talks about how strong the relationship is with the site manager at the Hanford site, Brian Vance, and how that's a very important relationship for the whole community, and how that relationship has evolved over time. And those are the kind of model relationships that we hope that exist at the various sites. But it's an evolution, and I always tell everybody it's a two-way street. Also, the local community has to be just as open in that relationship and has to be just as truthful as the DOE site manager does. And it's hard as you have site managers change over time, because a strong relationship with one, because that is a focus of that particular manager. And then as you change over to a different manager or a different elected official, that relationship may not exist. And sometimes that hurts the processes, and the relationship has to be rebuilt. We're lucky. Ike's been around a long time now, Ike White, the current head of EM, and he's built a pretty strong relationship with most communities. And he's been a very strong advocate, I believe, of a strong relationship, which obviously goes down to the site managers. I always say that's the real key, because I see other offices at the Department of Energy where that's not necessarily the key for the leadership, and the relationship with the local communities is not as strong as it could be, which I believe impacts the mission for those particular offices as well. But Ike and EM are real models for the department.
And finally, let me ask you, how do people access the community cleanup guide? What's the best way to access the guide and find out what all it contains, and to become part of the interactive program that the guide provides?
So all they have to do is go to our webpage, which is www.energyca.org. And it's on our front page. There's a link to it. We're doing everything we can right now to make sure that people find it and see it. We released it at the cleanup workshop. We're going to be focused a lot on it at the intergovernmental meeting that I talked about, which is at the end of November. And we're also going to be focused on it, throughout. And we really appreciate, Mike, you talking to us about it, because I think the guide, it is for everybody. It's not just for local governments, and we really wanted to provide guidance to any community member that's out there who wants to understand how the cleanup program works, that it's there. We also did it so the DOE people understand what the issues are and the focus is for the community, especially when we talk about things like risk, and how we look at risk a little bit differently most of the time in the different communities than the department may look at risk. So it's those types of things that we try and focus on.
Well, I'll repeat that website, energyca.org. We'll put a link to that on our website, gonefishingpodcast.com. And Seth, again, I want to say that the work that ECA does is extremely important, and it definitely helps the success of the environmental cleanup mission. We appreciate everything that you do for the communities around the DOE sites, and I want to thank you for being on the podcast today.
No, thanks, Mike, and it's great that you do this podcast. We've been watching them as each week that they come out, and they're great, and we've really enjoyed it. I think the whole EM program benefits by you having these podcasts. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Seth. I appreciate that.
Today's episode of the Gone Fission Nuclear Report is brought to you by Fluor. We're building a better world.